my name is Amanda Hurst, and I'm the director of the libraries here in Brookline. Thank you for joining us for an evening with Ben Merzrich, exploring the mind of a literary rock star. It's so great to see all of you tonight supporting books and reading. Before we begin, I have a few acknowledgments. First is our Library Board of Trustees who sponsored tonight's program. Thank you for your dedication to both the library and the Brookline community. Your tireless support and advocacy for the library and staff is truly special. Thank you to our community partners, Brookline Interactive Group, who are recording the program this evening, Brookline High School for the use of this lovely theater, and Brookline Booksmith, who will be selling signed copies of books by our speaker and host after the program. Your partnership is invaluable. Programs like this take a lot of planning and effort. Thank you to our program planners, volunteers, and this evening's host, Hank Philippi Ryan, for making tonight a success. Hank Philippi Ryan is the USA Today best-selling author of 13 novels of suspense. She has also won multiple prestigious awards for crime fiction, including 5 Agathas, 5 Anthonys, and the coveted Mary Higgins Clark Award. She's also the on-air investigative reporter for Boston's WHDH TV and has won 37 Emmys. Whoa. 14 Edward R. Murrow Awards. Yes. And dozens of other honors for her groundbreaking journalism. National book reviews have called Hank a master at crafting suspenseful mysteries and a superb and gifted storyteller. Hank's novels have been named Best Thriller of the Year by Library Journal, New York Post, BookBub, Pop Sugar, Real Simple Magazine, and others. Her current book is Her Perfect Life, a chilling psychological standalone about fame, family, and revenge. It received starred reviews from Kirkus and Publishers Weekly, which called it a superlative thriller, and was an Agatha Award nominee for Best Novel. Her upcoming thriller is The House Guest, coming in February 2023. Please welcome Hank Philippi Ryan.
Nice and reassuring to hear that bio, thank you. And it's also incredibly amazing to see you all, real people in real life. This is the first library event we've done live for how many years, you all? 5 years. So welcome to the newly inaugurated Library Live events. Thank you. On behalf of Brookline Library, thank you so much. I'm going to talk for about 30 seconds before we hear from Ben, because you heard that long intro to me, and that's lovely, but Ben, I know you all know who he is, and I know you all admire his work, but I want you to hear this bio because you really need to hear it. So give me these 30 seconds to tell you about Ben as we welcome him here tonight. Thank you so much for being here. Ben's writing career has spanned 19 years, and in those years, he's authored 24 books, and probably that number is wrong, because probably today he wrote another one. Is that wrong?
It is wrong. There's a couple more.
Investigative reporter me. But nevertheless, major international and New York Times bestsellers, fiction and nonfiction, with more than 10 million copies sold. That's his books to the moon and back, right? Something like that. It's more than that now, isn't it?
It's probably a little. It's a good number, though.
That's a good number. I would take that. So the genre you have created, Ben, cinematic and true stories of young geniuses battling their way through the gray area between right and wrong and succeeding at all costs. That's a cool thing. David and Goliath stories, includes the wildly successful Bringing Down the House, the inside story of 6 MIT students who took Vegas for millions, which spent 63 weeks. 63 weeks. I'm just saying that because as an author, 63 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list Anne Reid, the librarian, that's a long time. But anyway, and it was adapted into a major hit motion picture, 21. The Accidental Billionaire is also one of his books. The Founding of Facebook, A Tale of Sex, Money, Genius, and Betrayal, spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and appeared on hit bestseller lists and more than a dozen countries. It was adapted into the movie, you know it, The Social Network, which was nominated for 8 Oscars and won 3, and won Golden Globes for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Score. Mezrich, Ben, and Aaron Sorkin, moment of silence of reverence, share a prestigious Scripture Award for Best Adapted Screenplay as well. Mezrich is the only nonfiction author to have 2 adaptations open at #1 at the box office. Mezrich's latest book, The Anti-Social Network, was an international bestseller and is being made, and we're going to hear about this in about 30 seconds, into a major motion picture. Mezrich is also a writer and consulting producer for the TV show Billions. And I'm going to tell you one more thing, and this is not in his official bio. But he is the coolest person in the world. He is hilarious and funny and smart. And his writing lineage to me is Tom Wolfe and Truman Capote and Hunter Thompson. You know, sort of a super cool Michael Lewis is how I see it.
That's very nice of you.
So they're all the brilliant writers of narrative nonfiction, the way you do. You have this great ability to take complicated and important stuff and make it be fascinating and riveting and educational and brilliant and cinematic, and we'll talk about that right now.
Sure.
So, cinematic, Ben, you have news.
Yeah, so The Antisocial Network is being made into a movie right now. We started shooting last Monday, and the movie's called Dumb Money. If you know the GameStop story, the title kind of fits. And it stars Seth Rogen, Pete Davidson, Sebastian Stan from the Marvel movies, and Shailene Woodley, and I'm forgetting one of the actors. Oh, Paul Dano, and it's going to be awesome. Directed by the guy who directed Cruella and I, Tonya, and Pam and Tommy, and Sony just picked up the whole worldwide distribution rights, so it's the same people who made The Social Network are now making this movie. So it'll be out next summer, end of early fall next year, and I'm heading to set later in the week, next week actually, and excited about it all. So it's going to be really cool. This will be my first big movie since The Social Network. I've done some TV work since then, but it's exciting. It all kind of broke today, and yesterday was sort of about, you know, what we're doing right now.
How are you feeling about that?
I mean, it's exciting when you get that call, you know, that...
Well, what do they do when they call?
Well, the thing about a movie is there's lots of little excitements along the way, but it doesn't always mean something. Like, and you know this as an author, you sell the project to Hollywood, but then that's incredible and exciting and awesome, but it doesn't necessarily mean much because they buy 99 projects for every movie they make, basically. Then you get to the step where a director gets attached, then you get a step where an actor gets attached, and everything is getting you closer and closer to that day, but nothing matters until the day you start shooting. And so when you actually get to that point, it gets very exciting. And you know, I've been close so many times over the past decade since The Social Network. It's kind of crazy that it's been 10 years since that movie. But this is my first, you know, movie that's actually shooting. So it's exciting, it's incredible, and I'm looking forward to all of it. So.
Well, tell us a little bit about the story. This is fascinating. It's riveting. It's, you know, you are so good at telling the stories that we thought we knew about and we thought we understand, but then you just bring them to cinematic life. Talk a little bit about this.
So, I mean, a lot of you probably know the GameStop drama, or at least some of you probably bought GameStop or might have seen it all happening when it was happening. See a lot of young people, so, you know, young people definitely were more involved. Basically, I was sitting at home like everyone else, and it was the midst of the pandemic, and everyone was kind of locked at home, and suddenly this crazy stock, GameStop, started to rise and rise and rise, and eventually became worth as much as GE. And it's kind of a funny story because GameStop is a company that probably shouldn't even exist anymore. I mean, it's a brick and mortar store that's in malls that sells game consoles, right? And I love GameStop because I have kids who are 12 and 10, and we go to GameStop all the time. But I understand why you might bet against that as a company, especially during a pandemic. But what happened was this dude in Boston, he actually lived in Wilmington and is from Brockton, who would tie a bandana around his head and had cat posters behind him. He was a regular guy who'd been out of work a lot, who fell in love with the stock and ended up buying $50,000 worth, basically all his money, his family's money. And he started going on YouTube for 8 hours a day under the name Roaring Kitty, talking about GameStop. And everybody thought he was ridiculous. But then a funny thing happened. Millions of people on Reddit started to follow it. And they found out that this big hedge fund called Melvin Capital was betting against it, was shorting the stock, and they decided they were going to fight Wall Street, and they started to buy it and buy it and buy it, and it went from $5 a share to $20 a share to $500 a share. So it's this incredible story. Then it gets weird because the Robinhood, which was the app everyone uses to buy stocks, shut down buying of the stock. And a lot of people think there was a conspiracy behind it. Really what happened was Robinhood didn't have the money to put up for all of these buys. It ended up being more than 4 times their entire value. And so it all collapsed. And it's this incredible David versus Goliath story. So what happened was, it was a Wednesday. I'm sitting at home in Vermont. We were hiding out in Vermont from COVID. And everyone starts texting me saying, you should be writing this story. It's like one of your stories. And I was like, well, do I know people in the story? And I started to search around my tentacles, and I discovered I could get to some of the people in the story. So I wrote an 8-page book proposal, literally with no information. I just made up 8 pages of how I would write the story. And that was Wednesday. And by Friday, I had 11 movie studios bidding on it, on this 8 pages. And it got crazy. And it came down to MGM and Paramount, and it just got really, really nuts. And so I sold the movie. And then all the publishers, yeah.
It's so crazy that it was GameStop-y, the way that.
I mean, it was GameStop-y. I remember this. We were in our house in Vermont, and it was midnight, and these 2 studios were going neck and neck. And I'm walking around our house in Vermont. I can't even believe what's happening, because I'd literally written 8 pages. I had no information. I had no book that I made up based on what I thought the story probably was. And the studios are calling one after another. And it was just one of those, it was like a scene from The Player, if you ever watched that old Hollywood movie. It was just bizarre. And also it was in the midst of a time in the pandemic when I thought, what's going to happen to my career? What's going to happen to everybody's career? It was such a messy time for everyone that it just came out of nowhere, just like the GameStop drama. And so I sold it that night, and then I sold the book in an auction on Monday.
You were saying that then the publishers.
Then all the publishers start calling, and they all want to get it.
How would they know?
Because the agents, that's what the agents do, is that information leaks out, that there's this auction going on. So all of these scouts, so publishers have scouts whose job it is to see what's going on in Hollywood. And when a project gets hot in Hollywood, the scouts start calling their publishers, and the publishers start calling my agent. So my agent starts getting bids. It actually was funny, my agent called me up and goes, are you doing something right now? I'm getting all these calls about something. And I'm like, yeah, I'm selling a project to Hollywood. And he's like, well, I think you're going to sell the book too. So I sold the book. And then I was locked up like everyone else, and I wrote the book over the next 2 months. And the book actually came out within 6 months of me selling it. Now, it was a tough time to sell books. As you know, pandemic was not great for for like airport books, which is what my books often are. So I didn't, the book came out, but what happened was the movie was this platform, and it started to grow and grow and grow, and now we got to the point where we're shooting it. So it was an exciting project that came out of nowhere.
Let me talk to you a little bit more about this, because you wrote this book about real people, and the book is so immersive, and you take us right into their lives with the cat posters and the fear and the hotshot financier who's thinking this.
Gabe Plotkin, this is a guy who's never lost anything in his life. He's like the anti-Roaring Kitty. This is a guy, he's got an $11 billion fund. He worked for Steve Cohen, which was the biggest hedge fund in the world. And he couldn't understand why people were buying GameStop. It became this personal battle for him because this stock made no sense. And he had shorted it. Even when it was at $5, he continued to short it thinking it was going to go to 0. And instead went to 500. And by the way, it bankrupted his entire firm. His firm's out of business, gone, liquidated. He lost an $11 billion fund against a bunch of people sitting on their couches who were on Reddit.
What do you think about that? I mean, this is such a sea change in how people used to think about finance and how the markets work.
The markets are no longer what they were. It's not, we're in an irrational time, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot of anger. Younger generations have a lot of anger or they don't trust Wall Street because Wall Street has screwed people over and over again. And so it was a rallying cry. Let's take on Wall Street over this stock. And people like GameStop. It was nostalgic. People love going in there, even though it's kind of foolish. And GameStop is crazy. You walk through and there'll be a Mickey Mouse doll next to a chainsaw from Fortnite, right? It's the oddest store in the world. And the people who work there will talk to you for 45 minutes when you're trying to buy something. It's just a different environment. And I think people gravitated towards it. But we're seeing this with other beloved stocks too, like Bed Bath & Beyond, AMC, BlackBerry. What's
People are on
happened?
their phones now.
Yeah.
You see this right now.
Wall
in the
Street,
audience.
Wall Street is behind the gun on this, because what's happened was 1 million people sitting at home on Reddit are just as powerful as any Wall Street bank. And that's the big change now. Social media enabled a mass of people to essentially become a hedge fund overnight. And that's what's going on now.
I mean, so you wouldn't think that you would care about this much, but this book is completely captivating, and I can see how it would be so beautifully cinematic.
It's going to be a cool movie, and we're doing it. It's like a dark comedy, just because Seth Rogen and Pete Davidson are in it. You can guess that it's not going to be a very serious movie, but it'll be real. I've read the screenplay, and it's spectacular. And I just think it's going to be one of those movies that I think it's going to be like The Social Network. It's going to be one of those movies that captures a moment in our time, which I think this story, it's an origin of a change in the way we think. The one other big change that I interviewed people is that nobody is happy now with doubling their money. 2x is meaningless to most people. Everybody wants 10x or 100x. And I interviewed people who had put $100 in and their stock was worth $300. And it's like, well, why don't you sell it? I'm not going to sell it. $300 isn't going to change my life. I need $30,000. And I was like, well, that's not investing, right? That's gambling. But that's the mentality now people use to buy and sell stocks. And I think hedge funds have to understand that that's what people want. They need to change their lives when they make an investment. And quite frankly, doubling your money doesn't change your life, but making 10 times your money might. And so that's another change that's happening.
How does this affect you when you learn about these people and talk to these people? And how does it change your philosophy of the world or your view of...
I mean, that's a good question. The way I write my stories is I spend a lot of time with my characters. I kind of live with them. I live vicariously through them. And I start to sort of take on, I fall in love with my characters. Janet Maslin at the time just attacked me mercilessly for this. She called me the billionaire's best friend because I was writing a lot of books about billionaires. I do fall for my characters. And so I do start, believing in what they believe and understanding them. And so I really enjoyed writing this one and getting to know sort of the Roaring Kitty type of thing where you're just taking a shot. You're like, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to put all my family's money into this ridiculous stock. And it worked. He made $45 million.
You know what's interesting, because Janet Malcolm also used to say that people who... Maslin, sorry.
Yeah.
Janet Maslin would talk about how... I thought you said Malcolm. Okay,
no,
Janet
Maslin.
Maslin. All right,
Yeah.
I got it. But these people trust you. I mean, it seems like they
People
connected with you and told you things that they might not have
Yes.
divulged. How do you...
Yeah, that's part of the game. So sometimes they probably shouldn't trust me. I don't go in like a journalist with a notepad and a recorder. I never have used a recorder in my life. I've never recorded anything from anybody's ever told me. I go in like the guy at 2 a.m. who's hanging out with you at the bar. Or I'm following the Winklevi around for a year, just following them around in New York. Or like all of these stories that I write. I wrote a book about a UFO hunter, and I went out to Colorado, and he met me at the airport and strapped a bulletproof vest on me and handed me a gun and said, there's been a sighting, we're going out into the mountains. And I was like, are we going to go shoot a UFO? What are we doing with a gun? And I live with these people. I become a part of their story to tell their story. So they trust me because I'm going in that way. And it's not like I'm not trying to out anybody. I want to tell their story in their words. I will say with about 50% of my books, there comes a point right before the book's going to come out where I get that phone call from the main character, and they're like, can we just not do this? And I thought the book's coming out tomorrow.
That's happened more than once?
Oh yeah, it's happened multiple times. Because people don't realize when they're telling you their story, and I try to be very open with them and say, look, when this is out, your family's going to read it, people you know are going to read it, everyone in the world might read it if it's a big book. I mean, that's what I'm hoping, everyone in the world reads it. And they're like, yeah, this is going to be exciting, this is going to be great. And there always comes a moment when they start to realize that it's actually becoming real. And then they get nervous.
What do you tell them?
And I tell them it's too late. The book's coming out. It's already printed and it's out of my control. But there have been moments like that. And if you feel bad, you're like, I warned them, I told them everything about it, and I know it's not going to necessarily live up to it. I actually felt worse about other stuff. What happens when a movie gets made of a story? These characters become really famous for a short period of time. And then it kind of goes away. And it's hard for them after that period.
When the spotlight leaves.
When the spotlight moves, I move on to another book. But that's their life. So years later, they still come to you and say, let's do this. I want to do this. And I'm like, well, you should do that. Do what you want to do. But I've written 3 books since then.
And you were their friend at that
Well,
time.
I'm still their friend, but and I will say there's some people I write about who I don't want to be their friend. I mean, very dangerous, violent people.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
And I try and stay away from them after the book comes out. But the people who I do like and I am friendly with, I stay friends with them. But the story, that's their story, and they can do with it what they want. And their notoriety can give them plenty of things. They can do speaking gigs. They can maybe make another movie. Who knows? But I've moved on to another story. So it is tricky. There's a great scene in the movie Almost Famous. Did you ever see that movie, the rock and roll movie, Cameron Crowe,
Sure.
where the kid who's from Rolling Stone, right, is with the band, and he's like, "I'm not your friend," you know. And there are moments when I do sometimes feel that way, but I'm very careful not to out anybody. I tell them what I'm writing, and I will say, since the social network and since I've gained a little bit of people know who I am, people are more hesitant to talk to me. It's much harder now than it was 10 years ago, especially with like hedge fund people. They know, or CEOs or people like that, and they're like, I'm not going to talk to you, unless they want to see themselves in a movie. But I have been to dinners with people before, and they're like, "Oh, I'm not sitting next to you," because they're like, "You're going to write it down." I'm not going to write it down, but people do sometimes get nervous, and I'm sure you get that as an investigative journalist. If you show up, people probably do get nervous.
Oh, exactly.
Because you're taking them down sometimes.
Well, if they deserve it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So let's rewind a little bit. And I want to talk to you about each of these books because each one of them, and very quickly, is incredibly wonderful.
Yeah.
But what were you like as a kid? Did you always want to be a writer?
I mean, I was a nerdy, neurotic kid, but I always wanted to be a writer since I was about 12 years old. I was obsessed with it, and I became obsessed with it because of my parents. When I was little, I liked television. I was watching TV all the time, and my parents didn't like that. So they made a rule, starting when we were about 11, that we had to read 2 books a week before we were allowed to watch TV. So my brothers and I became speed readers at a very young age, for the wrong reasons, so that I could watch, Three's Company. But I decided at 12 I would be a writer, and that was all I would be. And my parents were not thrilled with that plan. So when I got to college, I basically told my parents, I'm gonna write, and my dad said, I'll give you 1 year after college where I won't let you starve. I'll give you the bare minimum, and you have to have some proof that you've made it, or else you're gonna have to go to law school. So I was in Boston. I moved into an apartment below a dental office with a friend of mine who was also a writer, Scott Stossel, who's a wonderful writer. And I literally wrote round the clock, and I wrote 9 novels in 1 year. 9 400-page novels. I was writing 40 pages a day. I wrote 10,000, pages. It was an insane amount of writing. I don't think my math is right.
Doesn't matter.
My kid can check that. But I literally wrote 9 novels in a year, and I would go to the post office. Back then it was post offices. Send it out, get rejection. Send it out, get rejection. All the postal workers knew me. I'd walk in, they'd go, "You get rejected again?" I'm like, "Yeah, I got rejected again." I got 190 rejections.
What was your favorite rejection?
I got rejected by a janitor at a publishing house. Because I did. I have the rejection letter still. I sent a manuscript to an editor who was no longer working there, and it was thrown in the trash. And the janitor took it out of the trash, read it, and sent me a rejection letter, which I have. I remember the New Yorker, I once sent an article in the New Yorker, and they used to send you a whole piece of paper in the middle that just said no. It was a page that said no.
Is that true?
I have that somewhere, yeah. Oh, yeah, I have
awesome.
it. I have actually been rejected by everyone I have worked with since. So I literally been rejected by my editor that I'm working with now, my agent that I'm working with now. Everyone has rejected me. There's nobody in publishing who's not rejected me.
It's a badge of honor.
It is. I mean, it's the most romantic part of your career. I don't know how you felt about it, but that was when it was kind of just fun. It was like, I'm writing, I'm broke, I'm spending all day in an apartment writing and sending in, rejection, rejection, rejection. I mean, now there's a lot of business to it. Back then, there was no business. It was all ambition and I'm going to make it.
Which you indeed did. What was the moment that it started to work?
Well, it took a while. So Bringing Down the House was my first successful book. But I had actually written 6 books before that had come out. So 9 books that didn't come out, then 6 books that were published that nobody read. So it was my 16th book, Bringing Down the House. And that book changed my life. And that's the story of the MIT kids who took Vegas. I was going to Vegas with them every weekend.
How did you find them?
I was at a bar called Crossroads in Boston. Some of you might know Crossroads. MIT dive bar, and the girl on the team, who Kate Bosworth ended up playing, was a fellow student of mine at Harvard. She was dating one of the MIT kids. It's just, you got to meet these guys. And they had all this money, and it was all $100 bills. And back, you never saw $100 bills in Boston. You just don't see them here. And I went over to the main character's house, and in his laundry was $250,000 in stacks of hundreds. And I was like, why do you have all this money? And he said, come to Vegas. And I started going to Vegas with him every weekend. And I essentially joined the MIT blackjack team. And for 6 months, I went to Vegas every weekend. This was, when I was at the age where you could do that. And it was just this crazy thing that I witnessed. And that was my first nonfiction book.
How did you get the idea to make that? I mean, you were writing.
I was writing fiction, thrillers that nobody was reading. I had written for the X-Files television show. So I had some success at that point. I had written a TV movie called Fatal Error, which none of you should ever see. Stars
I bet we can find that.
Oh God, Maddie in the Morning found, or Billy and Lisa found it the other day. It was Antonio Sabato Jr. and Robert Wagner, and it was like this horrible movie. But so I've had some success, but not real publishing success. So I thought, I'll just write this story, even though it happens to be true. And no journalism background, I knew nothing about nonfiction. But I said, I'm just going to write this like it's a thriller. So I just wrote it like it was a movie, and it went crazy. It was one of those books that just went crazy.
But the idea of taking, I mean, this is what narrative nonfiction is about, is that you take something that's true or true-ish and make it fun to read and make it read like a novel. How did you know how to do that?
Well, so I was obsessed with Hunter S. Thompson, and I was a big reader. I read everything there is to read. So I read every Michael Crichton, every John Grisham. I read everything. And I wanted to be Hunter S. Thompson without the guns and the drugs and the alcohol. And so essentially when I sat down to write it, I said, just screw convention. I don't care what the rules are. I'm going to write this story. I'm going to recreate dialogue based on interviewing everybody. I'm going to go to Vegas, and I'm going to live this story, and then I'm going to write it as it feels. And so I wrote short chapters. It's a fast book. And it was going to be a little book. The first printing was 12,000 copies, which was a very small first printing at the time. It was going to be this tiny book. I'd been paid less than I'd ever been paid for anything. And then a couple things happened. First of all, I'm sitting at home and the phone rings, and it was Kevin Spacey. Now, today, that's a different story, right? But back then, he was the biggest actor in the world. And he had called and said, I want to make a movie out of this. And then I got a Today Show. I booked the Today Show. I'd not ever booked anything like that before. It was this intern at my publisher who was her first day on the job as a publicist and had somehow gotten the book into the hands of the Booker of the Today Show. And they were like, we'll do this. This sounds like fun. So I go to New York, and I remember this very vividly. You kind of wanted at the time to be interviewed by Katie Couric or Matt Lauer, previous to his problems. But it was Al Roker. I got Al Roker. And I sit down, and it's me and Al just like this. And Al turns to me and he's like, are you nervous? And I was like, yeah, I'm nervous. And he goes, well, try not to think about the fact that in the next 5 minutes, you could entirely ruin your life. And at that moment, the camera went on. And if you watch the tape, I'm like this right as it starts. And it was like, it ended up, I don't remember the interview, it was a great interview. And that day, the book just went nuts. It froze on Amazon. It was #1, and it couldn't even buy it because this was in the early days of Amazon, and they couldn't handle the volume. Because what happened was every trader on Wall Street is also a gambler. And they saw it, and they all bought it at once. And so it just skyrocketed. And it was life-changing. It was one of those kind of moments in your life where it's just like, I don't know what just happened, but it was, yeah.
But you went to Las Vegas, you were on the MIT blackjack team.
Yeah.
Did you know how to play blackjack?
Now I do. Yeah. I got kicked out of a few casinos, let's put it that way. But I'm not a math genius. I was more like what they call a guerrilla player, which is they signal you and you do what they signal you to do. So you're just like a dumb gorilla, and they raise your bet, lower your bet, that kind of thing.
By signals?
Yeah, all hand signals.
So interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the thing is though, so you go into this place with these people who are doing this thing and immerse yourself in this.
Immerse, yes.
And then somehow you come out of it and make it into something else. How does your brain work?
Well, I live 2 parts to my life, and you can ask my wife Tanya about this, or my kids. Like at home, I'm somewhat reclusive, just sit in my room and write all day, very, very sort of normal. But then when I go on the road to do these stories, I become somebody else. I'm joining them in this. And truthfully, I'm terrified of everything. I'm very neurotic, anxiety-ridden. Everything scares me. I would never do that if I wasn't researching a book. But
you have a role.
I basically take on the role of whatever it is I'm writing about. But then when I come back home, it's like normal life. I'm locked up and writing as much as I can. I'm doing the kids' stuff as much as I can.
But your brain must store the action. And
Yeah, I have a very vivid visual imagination. So everything is like a movie. If you were inside my head, it's a movie going on all the time. Everything is just completely over the top too, and I can't always distinguish reality and fiction in my head. So when I put my stories together, I'm retelling the story as honestly and as truthfully as I can, but it's automatically dramatic the way I see it.
Automatically dramatic.
Yes.
That is really chilling. It's so
Yeah,
cool.
chilling.
I mean,
Yeah.
this is, talk about automatically dramatic. Let me get this out of the stack.
Yeah.
This book, Once Upon a Time in Russia.
Yes, that is a
So
big
this
story.
is terrifying. And it is timely, and I bet people are talking about it a lot right now.
Yes, we're about to announce a big television thing on it. We're going to have a big television series based on this on Netflix.
Well, tell us about this. I mean, how did you do this?
Yeah, so
How
this
did
story,
you know
if those of you who haven't read it, this is the true story of how Putin came to be and about all the oligarchs who kind of built him up and made him into the monster that he is today. And so the way this book happened was there's a director in Hollywood who used to always pitch me crazy stories. And they were always really dangerous. So he would call me up and go, Ben, man, I got a great story for you. And I'm like, what? And he goes, it's gun runners in Miami. I can get you in with them. You're going to hang out with them. You're going to go travel with them. And I'm like, well, how dangerous is he? Oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like a 9. I'm like, I'm not doing it. There's no way I'm going to Miami and doing this story. And so he called me up, and he was like, I got a story for you. But I'm not going to tell you what it is. And I'm like, why not? And he goes, because he won't do it. And I was like, well, then I'm not going to do it. He goes, I promise you, biggest story of your career, come to London. And I literally flew to London the next day on that one sentence, because he's a very big director, or was at the time. I flew to London, and I go, he gives me an address of this bar. And I show up to the bar, and outside are all these armored cars and limousines with security men with little earpieces. And I go, what is this? And I walk into the bar, and sitting at the bar is a very famous oligarch. One of the most powerful, I can tell you, I guess we can talk about it. Are we on camera? It's Roman Abramovich and a couple of other oligarchs. And I said, oh, no way. I'm not going to do this story. Oh, I knew who it was. Because I know that sort of thing. And I basically sat down at the bar, and they proceeded to tell me this insane story about how these oligarchs found Putin, how essentially Roman and this guy named Boris Berezovsky, who is known as the godfather of the Kremlin, and he was a car dealer. He owned car dealerships all over Russia. Yeltsin was the president at the time, and he was getting old and starting to die, and they wanted to replace him with someone they could control. So they found this guy who had helped Boris set up a car dealership in St. Petersburg. It was a low-level KGB agent named Vladimir Putin. They plucked this guy out of St. Petersburg, and they installed him first as the head of the FSB in Russia, which was the former KGB, and then as prime minister. And on his first week in office, he invited all of the oligarchs over to Stalin's old house. And this is a place where there are bullet holes in the walls where they used to line people up. And he sat the oligarchs down at a table, and he said, you've all made a lot of money. You can all keep your money, but from here on out, you stay out of my way. And any oligarch who stayed out of his way is an oligarch today, like Roman Abramovich. Any oligarch who stood up against him was found hanging, or fell out of an elevator, or fell out of a 2-story window. They're all dead. Boris Berezovsky stood up to him and was found hanging in his bathroom from a scarf that Roman Abramovich had purchased. Crazy story. They tell me this story, and I'm like, oh my God. I mean, can I tell this story? And
I mean, seriously.
the process of telling the story was terrifying. There were moments, I remember I was at a party, and all these Russians were around me, and this very large Russian comes up behind me and just sticks something in my back pocket. And he's like, don't look. And this was during the polonium poisoning time, so I'm like, oh God, I'm going to die. I get back to the hotel room, and I pull it out, and it's a computer key card. I have no idea what's on it. So I had a lawyer waiting in Boston at Logan Airport, just in case it was State Department secrets. I flew back with it, and it ended up having 20,000 pages of depositions with Putin, like all of this incredible information that this book is all built on that they wanted me to have. Another story was, there's a scene in the book where Roman and Boris wanted to set up an oil refinery in Siberia. The guy who was running it was this old world general. So they flew out to Siberia, and they met with him, and they said, will you give us your company? And he said, no, are you kidding? Get out of here. So they went back to Moscow, and that night, he went swimming in the Irkutsk River and drowned. his bodyguard, who was the only witness, got into a bar fight and died. So I write this scene, and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, wait a minute. So I call up Roman people, and I go, so this scene makes it seem like you had this man killed. And they said, yes, it seems that way. And I said, well, do you want me to change this? Is this okay? And they go, it's fine. And I was like, well, how is this fine? And they said, you have to remember that don't compare Russia in the 1990s to America in the 1990s. Compare Russia in the 1990s to America in the 1890s. In the 1890s, if there was a rival businessman who disrespected you, you killed him. And so that was the tone of working with these guys. It was continuously terrifying. Tanya can tell you that every time I got sick, I would be, did anybody bump into me? Did I eat something at a restaurant? For a year, I was terrified.
Well, there's a scene where there's an explosion.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking, this is so vivid, this is so real, how did he know?
Because the guy who told me the story was there. And it's like that sort of, I had that level of access to that story. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one who's ever really spoken to all these oligarchs and was able to get their stuff down. And I have heard through people that Putin has read the book and didn't dislike it. Because if you read the book, it's Putin during this story is attempting to rebuild Russia to its greatness. He chased the oligarchs out of Russia to create the old Soviet Union. Putin believes that the greatest mistake of the last 100 years was the fall of the Soviet Union. He believes Gorbachev was the enemy and that he wants to restore that greatness. That's who Putin is. So in the scope of this book, he did not disagree with it. So it's scary. I mean, they have no problem with the death and the murder. They want to be respected. And so it was an intense experience.
How did you walk that line?
Well, I mean, I remember I met this guy in New York, one of the oligarchs, and this is a barrel of a man with hands like anvils. And this is a guy who has done some seriously bad things. And we're walking in New York from one restaurant to another, and there's this group of NYU students behind us, and they're being really, really loud. And he turns to me, this Russian, and he goes, this is very annoying. And I said, well, it's New York, it's fun, it's exciting. He's like, shall I do something? And there's this moment, and it's like that scene in Jaws where the eyes of the shark roll back. I could see in his face that had I said yes, this would have ended very badly. And so I was like, no. And he's like, okay. And we continued the dinner, never mentioned it again. And it was just that was the level of the people that I was working with. So I would never do this story again, now that I'm in a different phase in my life. I would never put myself into a situation that felt unsafe as a writer.
But it's history, too.
I have turned down many stories that I know would be great stories, and historical important stories, because I don't want to put myself into danger. And so I won't go that step anymore, but there are plenty of young writers who will. And, you're an investigative journalist, you probably would just go for it, right? I am a chicken. I'm fully aware of who I am and where I am in my career. When I was 25, I would chase a story like that. But now, today, I absolutely would not write another story about Russian oligarchs, or I wouldn't write a story about Putin, or I wouldn't write a story about North Korea. There are other writers who can write that story. I'll go to Vegas, but I know where I want to write and what I want to write about.
And what is that?
I mean, I'm always looking for something that's going to be an origin story, or something that's going to change the world, something that's fun, that involves places I want to go, big money, and exotic locales, people that are interesting, geniuses. I don't really write crime stories. I've written a few, but I'm not really looking for a crime story. And something new. I get pitched so many stories that are similar to the things I've already done.
Well, let me interrupt you by saying, because I know it's a surprise interrupting you, but talk about all those things that you just listed. Something new, something fun, something with a lot of money, something where somebody wants something.
Yeah, the Facebook story.
The Facebook story is completely that.
It was a perfect story in so many ways. And not that you would think that automatically. I remember when I told my mom, I'm going to write a book about Facebook. She was like, what? Nobody's going to watch a movie about Facebook. No one's got any interest in that. Kevin Spacey said the same thing, and he was, one of the producers of the movie. He's like, I don't know if we can sell this. And then it ended up being a really great movie. So basically, the story got pitched to me. It was random 2 a.m. email. I was sitting at home. This was right before the movie 21 came out. And the email said, basically, my best friend founded Facebook and no one's ever heard of them. And this was 2007, before Facebook was on everyone, everyone knew what it was.
Did you know Facebook?
I knew what it was because my wife was on it, and so I'd seen the pictures and stuff, but I didn't really know what it was. So I went out for a drink with him, and in walked Eduardo Saverin. If you've seen the movie, it's like Andrew Garfield. Not quite as good looking as Andrew Garfield, because Hollywood does that. And if you watch 21, it's the best looking group of MIT kids
Yes,
you've ever
yes.
seen in your life. And I don't know, there's kids here, so I can't use the bad language. Although my kids have heard this one before. I can use one bad word. So Eduardo sat down at the table and he said, Mark Zuckerberg me. And that was the start of this conversation. And as a journalist, I said, tell me more.
Tell me.
And he told me this crazy story.
Did you know who Mark Zuckerberg was?
I knew who Zuckerberg was. I didn't know there was anybody else in the story. And the first people I found were the Winklevi. I went online, I found them on Facebook. And I befriended them on Facebook. And I started meeting with them in New York. We would meet in Penn Station, and they would hand me documents that no one was supposed to see.
And
The
they're
Winklevi
not
were my
very
first main
unobtrusive.
sources. Oh God, they're like mythological creatures. They're like something out of Greek myth. They're giant, 6'5", identical twin Olympic rowers with they're perfect. They dress the same. They finish each other's sentences. You'd go to dinner with them, and they'd order the exact same meal, and it would be 8,000 calories apiece, and they would devour it as they were talking to you. And I'm watching these guys like, this is incredible. I don't know where these guys came from, but they're going to make this movie. And they're going to make every story that I ever tell about those guys. And I essentially, what happened was, again, it's similar to what happened with GameStop. I wrote a 14-page book proposal. That's all. And I sent it to my agent. And it leaked onto the internet. Gawker, if you remember the Gawker website, printed my entire book proposal. Never seen anything like that before. And that day, everything went crazy. Facebook settled with Eduardo for $5 billion. And on the top of the agreement, it says, you may never speak to Ben Merzrich again. And I've seen the agreement because they were trying to stop the book. And so he moved to Singapore. He broke up with his girlfriend because it was Tanya's best friend. He sent me a legal restraining order that I was never to speak to him again, and he ran off, which I would do too. I think for $5 billion, all of you would do the same thing. My brother would leave me for $5 billion. Tanya, I don't know. $5 billion?
No pressure.
$5 billion?
No, she would. I know she wouldn't.
Really? Anyways, that same day, the phone rings, and it was my agent saying Aaron Sorkin read it online and wants to make this his next movie. And that same day, David Fincher called my agent and said, I want to direct this as my next movie. And this is all incredible news. As a writer, it's like winning the lottery. Except I hadn't actually written anything yet. I literally had a 10-page book proposal. And so I went to the Westin Hotel in Back Bay, because I lived in the building, basically. And Aaron Sorkin flew out. And I literally wrote the book in about 8 weeks. And I would hand chapters to Aaron. And basically, he took what I wrote, and he spent one more month after that writing the screenplay. That whole project was written in like 2 months.
It's so full of detail.
And the movie, by the way, went into production before the book came out, which never happens. And they cast unknowns pretty much. I mean, other than Justin Timberlake. He was the most known figure in that movie. Jesse Eisenberg wasn't known yet. Andrew Garfield hadn't done Spider-Man yet. It was incredible casting. And just, those guys are geniuses. I mean, Sorkin and Fincher. I won't say it was the most fun set in the world. Fincher is a very dark, intense director.
What's it like on set? What was it like on set?
Well, it was scary. It was always scary. Everyone was battling with each other. There was a lot of tension. And I remember the way Fincher films a scene. There was one scene in the movie where a bus pulls up to a finals club and a bunch of girls get out. It's maybe 30 seconds of film. He shot that scene from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. Literally 12 hours all night long. Reshot it, and I have no idea what he was looking for, but that's the way he shoots a movie. So watching this was like, it's like a grind. It's very intense.
But when everybody who's seen it, and everybody's seen it, right? You can remember it. You can remember dialogue. You can remember the attitude of people. You can remember where things happen.
Oh, it's such a perfect movie.
It's a perfect movie and a perfect book because it's so full of detail.
It's a lot of detail.
And so where does that come from?
So I interviewed a lot of people for this book. I spent a lot of time on the campus at the Phoenix Club, which is the club in the story. I can find sources. I'm very good at that. And so I essentially was hanging out with Sean Parker, who's Justin Timberlake played in the movie. Sean and I became good friends because his mother liked bringing down the house. And so I would go to his house, I would go to his, and he's crazy. The Winklevi were big sources. Eduardo was my main source. Mark would not speak to me. So I would go back and forth to Mark. Eventually he let me send him questions, which he refused to answer. He was very unhappy that I was doing this book. I remember when I went on book tour, every stop, they would already have a quote from Facebook that said, Ben Merzrich is the Jackie Collins of Silicon Valley. And I wanted to put that on the back of the book. I don't think we did. My editor wouldn't let me, But all it says is, they just wanted to meet some girls. That was our tagline.
But
Anyway.
Jackie Collins was
Yeah.
a good storyteller.
I love Jackie Collins. I would like to be the Jackie Collins
Yeah.
of Silicon Valley. But, it was just one of those things where Mark did not want me telling that story. But I had so many other sources. Like, we knew what was in his dorm room, down to every detail. I remember he watched the movie and one of his quotes was, "I don't know how they got every piece of clothing I wear right." And like literally every piece of clothing that he wore was in that movie. And a lot of it was in the book. I mean, I had a lot of sources.
When you saw the opening of the movie and when you saw the
Yeah.
movie begin,
Yeah.
what did you think?
I mean, I try to remember where I watched that movie for the first time. Do you remember where we watched that movie for the first time? It was, I think it was in Boston. And I remember the opening scene is just like 8 pages of dialogue, which normally a screenwriter would never get away with. But it's Aaron Sorkin, and it's so incredible. And then you have the 9 Inch Nails music. You have this incredible score. I knew from the first minute of that movie this was going to win the Oscar. It was just one of those moments where you're like, this is the best screenplay that I've ever seen. I had read the screenplay. He handed it in. First draft was barely touched. And I remember reading and going, how do you even do this? It's really incredible. 21 I watched, the first time I watched it, I was at the Sony lot, and it was me and Lawrence Fishburne in an empty studio. And I was like, I'm with Morpheus. Like, it was a crazy moment. I watched it. Yeah, it was so cool. So it's fun. And then we got to do a big Boston premiere. It was like and we're going to do a big Boston premiere for Dumb Money as well. And Dumb Money is feeling a lot similar because it was a short proposal. It all happened so fast, and it's got a really incredible.
Well, the article in Deadline today about Dumb Money was so enthusiastic.
Yeah.
Listed all the people who are. I mean, it's the team.
It's the team. We really pulled it together, and the story is it's social networky, but it's also got this young commercial angle to it, which the Social Network didn't have. So I do think it's going to be a really interesting, and we're doing it in theaters. So hopefully, COVID will be down to the point where we can get away with it at the end of next year. But it is going to be a theater release, which I'm thrilled for. I love streaming, but I really love movie theaters. So I would love to see it get back to that.
Going back to what you were saying about when you watch the Social Network work for the first time, that opening scene is such a grabber.
Yeah.
And every opening scene of every one of your books is the same.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think about that from a craft standpoint?
I do. So I learned that from Michael Crichton, I think. I used to keep Michael Crichton books on my desk as I wrote, and Jurassic Park and a couple of the other ones. He's a master at pulling you into something. And if you read his books, you just can't get away. And that was something I learned very early in my career. Yeah, is that you want to open it with some sort of kicker like that. So even though I'm writing nonfiction, I'm doing it in a thriller style, which a lot of people in nonfiction do now, but did not do when I started doing it.
Do you? I mean, when I was one of my favorite books, of course, is In Cold Blood.
Oh yeah.
And part of the reason I love it is that it feels so real. But then I think Truman Capote couldn't know that.
No.
And so there's truth and what feels like truth.
Yeah.
How do you balance that?
Yeah. I mean, listen, what I do is not for everyone. And I get that. There are journalists out there who review my books and say, what is he doing here? This isn't nonfiction. But I believe it's a very valid form of nonfiction. You take a story, you research the heck out of it, you know everything that happened, and then you write it in a dramatic fashion. I really think that The Social Network and Accidental Billionaires is a true telling of that first year of Facebook. But Mark Zuckerberg might disagree because there are other points of view to that story. And for instance, with dialogue, I interview half the group that was there. They tell me what was said. I write it, based on what they said, but it's not exact words. I'm recreating the dialogue. I could just say they talked about this. I don't think that's any better. But what I do gives you the feel of what happened in that scene. So I go into this. I'm very open about my style. There will definitely be journalists who will say, I'm not a newspaper writer.
Right.
I'm not a newspaper writer. This is not a newspaper, wouldn't be written in the newspaper. But this is how I write my nonfiction.
But it's very well researched. I mean,
Yes, I do research the heck out of it. And I often have a lot of legal documentation. The funny thing is when reviewers point out things they think couldn't possibly be true, those are all things that are definitely true. In this book, there's a story about Zuckerberg eating, I think, koala. And all of these reviewers are like, I don't believe Zuckerberg ever ate koala. But that was from an actual sourced interview between two people who were on the boat where Zuckerberg ate koala. So I mean, it was something like, there were scenes like that. I always get called out on it. I'm like, no, that's actually true. The things that are not necessarily might be the color of a carpet, like things that aren't as important. All of the important beats are very much true.
And that's because you have this visual brain that.
Well, I see the scene, and then I write the scene, and then I go back and try and make it as you know, I go through it, all the documentation, and be like, I know, if I don't know the color of that carpet, I might leave it. But in reality, anything that's important has been sourced.
Which is why they're so completely entertaining and educational. I think one of the fun things about reading your nonfiction is that, and one of the challenges for you as well, is that we know what happens in the end.
Yeah.
We know what happens.
Often with these stories, yeah.
Yeah, and so you're interested in how and why
Yeah.
and who and what and how we got there. Is that fun?
Yeah, it is fun. I mean, listen, I love writing the books that I write. It's always kind of a blast. And often you do know the end of the story. So that's not the reveal. The reveal is usually what leads up to that, or what are all the clues early on about why that actually happened. So often with true stories, you already know the story, and it took place 10 years ago.
We love it. I know we're running out of time, but I don't want to not talk about the Midnight Ride.
Yeah, we can do that. And we're gonna do Q&A.
Oh
too,
yeah,
like,
absolutely.
so
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Midnight Ride is. I can tell about how this came to be.
Yes, so this was in the depths of the pandemic. You know, I was in a desperate place, as I've said many times. I'm a hypochondriac and neurotic, and I'm at home, and I'm like, oh my God, it's the end of the world. And basically, I got a call from the Boston Globe, and Linda Henry, who owns the Globe, and the editor-in-chief, Brian McGorry, they said, listen, we're thinking of trying to bring back something from like the Dickens age. Mm-hmm. We want to do a serialized thing in the Globe. It'll run every day for 20 days, we want you to do it. And I thought about it, and I was like, this sounds awesome and terrifying. I'll do it, but I don't want to do nonfiction. I want to write a Da Vinci Code style thriller that takes place in Boston. And maybe I was half hoping they'd say no, because it was a crazy thing to do. And they said yes. So I basically wrote this book day by day over 20 days. And it ran in the Globe as The Mechanic. Some of you might have seen it. And it built an incredible readership. It was really awesome. By the end, there was 250,000 people reading it. It was like a massive book club. And it was just one of the most fun experiences of my writing career. And then I sold the book rights, and I sold the movie to Steven Spielberg. So then I wrote a draft of the screenplay for Spielberg. And the book, it comes out in paperback on November 1st. And then it comes out, the sequel I'm writing right now for next year.
Because it needs a sequel.
Because I purposefully ended it on a cliffhanger, which actually pissed a lot of people off, including my dad, who was like, what are you doing? Finish the book. But I'm going to write a whole series, so I'm hoping people stick with it.
It's a tour de force, because the idea that you had to write it and send it in as you did it.
I did it, yeah.
And not.
But luckily, it took place all in Boston, which I know very well. It took place all along the Freedom Trail, which I spent a lot of time on. And so it was easier to research, even from my bunker in Vermont, because I knew what I was writing about. But it goes back into American history, so I had to learn an awful lot. I have these amazing friends at the Paul Revere House who became sources for me, who I could ask questions, and professors who actually know this stuff. So actually, everything in that book more is true than you would realize. Let's put it that way.
That's so. I mean, it's all about history, as you said, American history,
and a secret going back in the Revolutionary War. Paul Revere and all these people were not who you thought they were. Let's put it that way.
That's what it should be done.